A government scientist was secretly dosed inside a place built on trust and professional certainty. Within days, he was dead below a New York hotel window, and the case still refuses to go quiet. The man was Frank Olson, and this story is not built from rumor or internet mythology. The dosing is documented. The death is documented too. And the gap between them keeps the file alive. That gap is not a minor detail buried in the case. It is the part that makes everything darker once you understand what surrounds it. Because Olson's death does not stand alone inside a simple, tragic story. It sits in the shadow of a real Cold War program that no longer belongs to fantasy alone. That program had a name that still sounds unreal to modern viewers. But MK Ultra is no longer a serious matter of historical doubt. So the first question is not whether it existed at all. The harder question is what kind of fear made these methods seem acceptable behind closed doors. What pressure, what logic, and what hidden belief pushed ordinary limits out of the way. What kind of institution keeps moving when the human cost is already impossible to ignore? To understand that, we have to step backward before we move deeper. We have to return to the early Cold War and the anxiety that shaped secret policy. American intelligence systems were gripped by one growing psychological fear. They believed rival states might have discovered new ways to pressure and destabilize minds. Some of those fears were inflated by panic and strategic paranoia. Some were rooted in real concern about coercion, pressure, and resistance. But inside secret institutions, fear does not wait for perfect proof before it starts moving policy. It only needs to feel urgent enough to justify action that would never survive public scrutiny. Once something feels urgent behind classified walls, oversight weakens and budgets begin to grow. Projects multiply faster than accountability, and systems start protecting themselves before they protect people. That is the world in which MK Ultra emerged, not calm science, but secrecy mixed with rising psychological obsession. By the early 1950s, the CIA was exploring methods of behavioral influence. They were testing ways to reduce resistance, alter perception, and measure psychological disruption. By 1953, one of those efforts had been formally organized. That effort was placed under the name that would later become infamous across decades. The program is closely associated with Sidney Gottlieb, one of its key names in the surviving record. That matters because this was not some fringe operation far outside the institution. It was planned, funded, and shielded inside the system itself. And that makes the case more serious than the myth of one rogue actor ever could. Now here is the first correction most viewers need. MK Ultra was not one neat experiment with one clean method and one clear result. It was not one room, one machine, or one elegant breakthrough waiting quietly at the end. What survives in the public record looks much more scattered and much more unstable. It appears as a loose umbrella over many sub-projects and many different routes of activity. Those routes extended through researchers, contractors, institutions, and hidden funding channels. Later reporting linked the program to roughly 150 sub-projects. But even that number survives inside a damaged archive with missing context and broken continuity. So the picture is real, but it is also fractured. And that fracture is one reason the story still feels unfinished when people revisit it now. Some projects examine psychoactive substances and altered states of mind. Others examine stress, memory, suggestion, confusion, and the weakening of resistance under pressure. That sounds extreme because it truly was extreme. But the more unsettling truth is that secret work is not always precise work. The surviving material suggests something messier than the legend people imagine. Not a flawless machine, but a dangerous search protected by too many layers of secrecy. Research was pushed outward into outside settings where oversight was harder to keep consistent. That distance mattered because it made responsibility harder to trace from start to finish. Universities, hospitals, and intermediaries entered the chain in different ways. Sometimes they had only partial awareness of the sponsor behind the work. That detail matters far more than it first appears. Hidden sponsorship does not only hide a program from the public eye, it also dilutes responsibility inside the system itself. It spreads blame across distance, layers, institutions, and bureaucratic separation. Now we return to the thread most viewers remember first: the agency's serious interest in psychoactive substances and their possible effects. The record shows attention to whether chemicals could alter perception and reduce resistance. It also shows interest in disrupted memory and changed responses under controlled pressure. That interest is documented in surviving public material. And once that fact is accepted, the story becomes darker almost immediately. Because we are no longer dealing with abstract speculation, we are looking at deliberate attempts to test what could be done to a human subject. But discipline matters here more than ever. Documented ambition is not the same thing as documented success. The surviving public record does not clearly prove a perfected system of total mind control. And that distinction must stay clear if the truth matters more than spectacle. The program was real, and the secrecy was real. The ethical violations were real too, even without adding what cannot be firmly shown. But the strongest myth goes farther than the surviving evidence cleanly supports. And when that line gets blurred, the warning becomes weaker instead of stronger. Now we return to Frank Olson directly, because Olson's case is where the human cost hardens into something impossible to abstract away. In late 1953, Olson attended a retreat linked to sensitive research circles. That setting should have been governed by trust, restraint, and professional limits. During that event, he was secretly dosed without meaningful consent. That remains one of the darkest confirmed facts in the entire file. There is no honest way to soften what that means. A person was drawn into a hidden act without a real chance to refuse it. Days later, Olson fell from a hotel window in New York. His death was officially treated as a fall, but the official label never ended the questions. Once the secret dosing became publicly known, the emotional shape of the case changed completely. The story no longer looked like an isolated death surrounded by unfortunate coincidence. A scientist linked to sensitive work, secretly dosed, and dead within days is already enough. That sequence alone is strong enough to keep viewers locked into the case. His family later received a formal government apology. That alone shows how serious the matter became once scrutiny grew stronger. An apology does not answer every question left behind, but it acknowledges that something deeply wrong happened inside the story. The record strongly confirms the dosing, the death, and the long controversy that followed. What it does not fully settle is every disputed detail from Olson's final hours. And that unresolved space is exactly what keeps the case alive across generations. Because the confirmed core is already heavy, and the missing part prevents closure. Now we reach the next major shock inside this file. Why is the full picture still incomplete after so many years and so much attention? One answer is simple, direct, and devastating. Important records were later destroyed. In the early 1970s, large numbers of files were reportedly ordered destroyed. That permanently changed what later investigators could ever hope to reconstruct in full. Destroyed files do not merely delay understanding for a time. They erase context, weaken accountability, and narrow the future of the evidence itself. That is why this story still feels half-lit. Not because nothing happened, but because part of the map was deliberately removed. Missing files create a dangerous kind of uncertainty. They do not prove every later theory automatically, but they create room where myth expands quickly. So how did the public learn anything at all if so much had already vanished? Because not everything disappeared, and some traces survived in ways that still mattered later. In the mid-1970s, major investigations exposed intelligence abuses more openly. Public pressure made denial harder to maintain as more pieces entered official view. The Rockefeller Commission examined misconduct linked to intelligence activities. The Church Committee pushed the issue further into public view and lasting public memory. Later, Additional surviving records were found, including financial material that escaped destruction. That mattered because money leaves patterns even when narrative files have been cut apart. Those financial traces helped investigators connect projects, institutions, and hidden channels more clearly. Even with that, the archive remained incomplete in ways that still shape every serious retelling. That means the case can never be handled honestly without restraint. We have to separate what is documented from what is inferred, and both from what is imagined. That is what real investigation does when a story becomes this loaded. It protects the line between evidence and theater from collapsing under emotional pressure. Now let's test the strongest theories the way a careful viewer should. Not by asking what sounds darkest, but by asking what the surviving record can actually carry. One theory suggests MK Ultra was mainly an interrogation program shaped by Cold War fear. That sounds plausible because the historical context and documented aims point in that direction. The agency showed interest in weakened resistance and changed responses under pressure. That makes the theory strong enough to take seriously, but not strong enough to overstate. The public record still does not show one clean breakthrough that solved the problem reliably. So the theory fits the shape of the story, but still stops short of final certainty. A second theory suggests something broader and darker than interrogation alone. It suggests a durable system for direct control over human behavior itself. That idea gains power because the known facts are already alarming. And the missing files make everything feel larger, darker, and more technically complete than proven. Yet, the surviving evidence remains narrower than the strongest legend. It shows experimentation and abuse, but not a clearly proven machine of perfected total control. So the theory feels possible to many viewers, especially when the gaps are considered. But it still is not clearly verified by the surviving public record. A third theory suggests a more chaotic and bureaucratic conclusion, that the program was fragmented, shielded, reckless, and internally inconsistent across many sub-projects. That interpretation fits the surviving archive remarkably well. Distributed methods, uneven discipline, damaged context, and a structure that looks unstable from inside. And that may be the most unsettling possibility of all. Because flawed systems can still produce devastating harm even when they fail at their grandest goals. A system does not need to be perfect to be dangerous. It only needs power, secrecy, weak restraint, and enough distance to hide responsibility. That may be the clearest warning in the whole case. A program can fail at total control and still succeed in doing real damage to real people. Now consider what that means for the viewer watching this unfold. The danger here is not only what the program may have wanted, it is also what institutions can become when fear starts setting the boundaries. Once fear becomes policy, secrecy becomes habit, and habit becomes structure. And once that structure exists, it becomes easier to rationalize actions that should have stopped immediately. That is where this story stops being just a Cold War file and starts feeling modern again. Because every era has institutions that claim urgency. Every era has systems that say normal rules must bend because the stakes are too high. That is why this case still hits so hard now. It is not only about one program, one death, or one decade. It is about what happens when a powerful system starts protecting itself first. When that happens, human beings become easier to classify, move, and rationalize. That is the moral pressure sitting inside this file, and it is one reason the story keeps returning even after so much time has passed. So what can we say with confidence if we stay grounded and disciplined? We can say that MK Ultra was real and tied to secretive human experimentation. We can say that Frank Olson was secretly dosed and later died in a case shadowed by unanswered questions. We can say that important records were later destroyed, permanently damaging clarity and reconstruction. We can also say something equally important for honest viewers. The surviving public record does not clearly prove perfected total mind control. That distinction matters because the truth is already dark enough without inflation. A secret government program crossed major ethical lines and operated behind weakened oversight. It left the public rebuilding truth from fragments, hearings, and damaged traces. That alone is enough to make this case endure in memory without any extra embellishment. We still do not know the full scale of everything involved. We do not know the full internal logic, and we do not know the full erased cost. That is why MK Ultra endures not only as a conspiracy story. It endures as a documented case with missing pages, damaged continuity, and lasting unanswered gaps. And the missing pages may be the heaviest part of all, because what is known is already disturbing, and what was erased remains impossible to measure completely. That is why viewers keep leaning closer instead of pulling away. The file offers enough fact to shock and enough absence to keep the mind working. It gives you documentation, contradiction, and a silence that still feels active. And that combination is exactly what makes a mystery impossible to leave too quickly. So the real power of this story is not only its darkness, it is the way the confirmed record and the missing record push against each other. That pressure keeps the case alive every time it is opened. And it keeps the audience searching for answers long after the obvious facts have ended. If you want more evidence-first mysteries built from real records and unresolved gaps, stay here. Because here we follow the surviving file before the legend and the documented trail before the louder myth.